By 7:30 on a gray Monday morning, the surgical wing of St. Alder Medical Center was already moving at full speed. Nurses crossed polished hallways with tablets in hand. Residents hurried toward briefing rooms, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the upper corridors. It was the kind of morning that looked ordinary from the outside, but inside the hospital, everyone knew it was anything but. St. Alder was hosting one of the most important medical conferences of the year. Specialists from across the country had gathered to discuss a new approach to complex neurological trauma cases. Cameras had been set up in the auditorium, hospital board members had arrived early, and the press office had spent weeks preparing statements. It was a chance for St. Alder to prove once again that it stood at the center of modern medicine. At the heart of it all was Chief Surgeon Roland Voss. For more than 20 years, Voss had built his reputation on precision, discipline, and results. He was brilliant, no one denied that, but he was also known for his sharp tongue and impossible standards. In his world, respect was earned through credentials, titles, and years spent proving oneself in elite institutions. That morning, he stood near the glass conference room overlooking the city, reviewing a digital schedule while his assistants moved around him. "Panel begins at 9, one of them said. "Fine. Media interview at 11. Move it to noon. And the guest consultant arrives at 8. At that, Voss finally looked up. "The mystery consultant," he said flatly. The assistant hesitated. "Yes, sir." For weeks, there had been rumors about a final addition to the conference panel. The board had insisted on bringing in an outside expert whose identity had been kept private until arrival. Even Voss had not been told much, only that this individual had rare expertise in trauma systems and cognitive recovery models. He disliked surprises. "Whoever they are," Voss muttered, "I hope they understand this is not a teaching seminar." At exactly 8 o'clock, the hospital's front entrance opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was carrying a weathered leather folder under one arm and a small overnight bag in the other. Her coat was simple, dark blue with no designer label in sight. Her shoes were practical. Her hair was tied neatly back, and there was nothing flashy or polished about her appearance. She looked more like someone visiting a patient than someone invited to a high-level medical conference. At the reception desk, she gave her name softly. The clerk checked the list, then looked up in surprise. "You're expected upstairs," she said quickly. The woman thanked her and made her way toward the private elevator. Two residents standing nearby exchanged looks. "That's the consultant?" one whispered. "No chance." But she was. When she entered the executive conference room on the 12th floor, the conversation slowed. The room was filled with specialists in tailored suits and white coats, many already seated around a polished oval table. Their badges displayed long titles and affiliations from prestigious institutions. She paused at the doorway, calm and composed. "I'm here for the panel," she said. Several eyes turned toward Voss. He studied her for a long moment. "This is a restricted session," he said. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm aware. And you are." She stepped forward and handed over her credentials packet. "Dr. Ilara Quinn." The name meant little to most in the room. Voss opened the folder and glanced through the documents. Then his eyebrows lifted. "This can't be right." The room grew still. "These records show international field certifications, emergency systems work, trauma consulting." He flipped another page. "No long-term academic post. No hospital tenure beyond short appointments. No published institutional affiliation." He looked up. "Who approved this?" One of the board members cleared his throat. "She was selected by the advisory committee." Voss gave a dry laugh. "With respect, this is a medical summit, not a volunteer workshop." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the table. Ilara remained silent. Voss placed the folder down. "You expect me to believe someone with this unconventional background belongs among leading neurosurgeons?" His tone sharpened. "Dr. Quinn, where exactly did you train?" She answered simply, "In several places." A faint ripple of amusement moved through the room. "That's not an answer. It's the truth." Voss leaned back in his chair. Forgive me if I prefer specifics over mystery. Still, she did not react. There was no anger in her face. No embarrassment. Only patience. It unsettled him more than if she had argued. One of the surgeons near the window adjusted his glasses. Perhaps she's here as an observer? Another added, or for systems consulting? Voss folded his arms. Then she can observe quietly. He gestured toward an empty chair at the far end of the table. Take a seat. The placement was deliberate. Far from the center discussion. Far from influence. Alara walked to the chair and sat down without protest. As the briefing began, Voss launched into a presentation about the future of trauma response in urban hospitals. He spoke with authority, moving through slides and surgical case studies with practiced ease. For the first 20 minutes, no one addressed her. But halfway through the discussion, a complex case simulation appeared on screen. A patient with overlapping neurological trauma, delayed response markers, and unstable memory mapping. Voss asked the room for recommendations. Specialists offered theories. Different protocols were suggested. No consensus formed. Then quietly Alara spoke. The response order is wrong. The room turned. Voss stared at her. Excuse me? She pointed to the simulation. You're prioritizing structural intervention before stabilizing cognitive disruption. If the memory pathways collapse first, surgery won't restore baseline function. A silence followed. Voss narrowed his eyes. That model is based on accepted national procedure. She nodded. For standard cases, yes. This isn't standard. One of the board members leaned forward. What would you do differently? Alara stood and approached the screen. Without hesitation, she rearranged the treatment sequence. Step by step. Clear. Direct. Logical. She explained how early sensory calibration could preserve neural orientation before deeper intervention. The room listened, even the skeptical surgeons. When she finished, one of the younger specialists checked the numbers, then looked up. She's right. Another followed. The survival probability increases. A murmur spread across the table. Voss remained still. His jaw tightened. For the first time that morning, he had no immediate response. Alara returned to her seat. No triumph in her expression. Just quiet certainty. The session continued, but the mood had shifted. People who had dismissed her now watched more carefully. Some took notes when she spoke. Others began asking questions. She answered each one calmly, without arrogance. Her knowledge was not theoretical. Carried the weight of lived experience. By the lunch break, whispers filled the corridors. Who is she? Where has she worked? How did no one know about her? No one had clear answers. Only fragments. Field hospitals. Emergency response units. Overseas trauma recovery teams. None of it fit the polished image expected at St. Alder. And that made her even more intriguing. Voss, however, was not impressed. At least not openly. He stood alone near the conference windows, staring down at the city below. One of the board members approached. You owe her some respect. Voss did not turn. She's intelligent. I'll give her that. You humiliated her in front of everyone. She walked into my conference with incomplete records and vague credentials. She was invited because of what she knows. Voss exhaled sharply. And yet no one can explain where she came from. The board member lowered his voice. Perhaps that should concern you. Voss finally looked over. What's that supposed to mean? But the man simply walked away. Across the room, Alara sat alone with a cup of tea, reviewing handwritten notes in the margin of an old medical text. She looked untouched by the tension around her, as if none of it mattered, as if she had been through far worse than skeptical surgeons and whispered judgments. A nurse approached her cautiously. Dr. Quinn. She looked up. Yes. I just wanted to say, the way you handled that case study, it was remarkable. Alara smiled softly. Thank you. The nurse hesitated. Can I ask something? Of course. Why didn't you defend yourself earlier? She considered the question, then answered gently. Because people reveal themselves faster when you let them speak. The nurse was quiet for a moment. then nodded. Before leaving, she glanced at the worn leather folder beside Alara. There was something unusual stamped in faded ink on the corner, a symbol she didn't recognize, and beneath it, barely visible, a phrase in small print, authorized strategic clearance. The nurse looked up, confused, but Alara had already closed the folder. And in that moment, though no one in the room realized it yet, the day had only just begun. The afternoon session at St. Alder Medical Center began with far less ease than the morning had. The polished confidence that had filled the conference room earlier had been replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. People were still discussing Dr. Alara Quinn's analysis from the case simulation, and while many now viewed her with curiosity, Chief Surgeon Roland Voss remained visibly unmoved, at least on the surface. He returned to the front of the room with the same commanding posture, his white coat crisp, his tone steady. But those who knew him well could sense the tension in the way he adjusted his cuffs and paused between sentences. Alara sat in the same seat at the far end of the table, her hands folded calmly over the weathered leather folder. She had not tried to draw attention to herself, nor had she used the respect she had quietly earned to shift her place in the room. That somehow irritated Voss even more. He preferred clear competition. He understood ambition, but her stillness unsettled him. As the next discussion opened, this one on integrated trauma systems, Voss directed questions toward every other panelist before finally turning to her. "Dr. Quinn," he said, voice cool, "perhaps you can explain to the room how one becomes a leading authority in neurological trauma without a formal institutional record." The air tightened. Several people looked down. The question was not about medicine. Everyone knew that. It was a challenge. Alara met his gaze. By working where records matter less than outcomes. A few heads lifted. Voss gave a short laugh. "That sounds poetic. But medicine isn't built on poetry." "No," she replied. "It's built on decisions." A low murmur moved across the table. He stepped closer. "Then tell us plainly, what hospitals have you served in?" She answered with calm precision. "Field units, emergency deployments, crisis zones, rehabilitation networks." "Which ones?" "Several under confidentiality agreements." There it was again, that wall no one could see past. Voss turned toward the room. "You see? Vague answers. Unverifiable claims." He spread his hands. "And yet we are expected to treat her as an equal in this setting." One of the senior cardiologists shifted uncomfortably. "That may be enough, Roland." But he continued. "No. We are scientists. We rely on transparency." He looked back at Alara. "If your experience is as significant as implied, then surely there are published studies under your name?" She was still, and for a moment, then said, "There are reports. Most are classified." A few people exchanged glances. Someone near the back almost smiled, as if assuming it was an exaggeration. Voss seized the moment. "Classified?" His tone sharpened with disbelief. "Now we're entering fiction." A light wave of nervous laughter moved through the room. But Alara did not flinch. She simply sat there, composed, letting every word land without resistance. That silence only encouraged him. "Tell me, Dr. Quinn," he said, leaning against the conference table. "When someone with your unusual resume arrives at one of the country's top hospitals, do they expect us to suspend judgment out of courtesy?" "No," she answered. "Good. They should expect judgment." That response caught him off guard. She continued, "But they should also expect fairness." The room fell still. Voss straightened. "And what fairness have you been denied?" Alara looked around the table, then back at him. "You judged my worth before asking what I knew." The sentence was simple, but it landed harder than anyone expected. No raised voice, no accusation, just truth. For a brief moment Voss said nothing. Then he smiled thinly. "Very well. Let's test that knowledge." He tapped the screen, and a new case file appeared. A difficult scenario involving a post-surgical trauma patient with rapidly shifting neurological markers. The kind of case that often had no easy answer. "Walk us through it," he said. He folded his arms. The implication was clear. If she failed, his doubts would be justified. If she hesitated, the room would remember. Alara rose and approached the screen. She studied the scans, the notes, the vitals. Then she asked a question no one expected. Where is the patient's environmental history? Voss frowned. It's not relevant. It is if cognitive disorientation is involved. This is a surgical review. And surgery is not always the first solution. The room held its breath. She turned back to the data. The issue isn't the lesion. It's the response chain. She explained how the symptoms pointed toward external sensory overload rather than structural decline. She proposed a treatment shift, less invasive, more adaptive. Again, she was clear, direct, certain. And again, the numbers supported her. A resident recalculated the projected outcomes. His face changed. She improves recovery odds by 23%. Silence. No one laughed this time. No one questioned her. Even Voss could not dismiss the results. But instead of acknowledging them, he stepped back and said coldly, "Interesting theory." The room knew better. It was not theory. It was precision. Still, he refused to yield. By the end of the session, the tension between them had become impossible to ignore. In the hallway afterward, several staff members approached Alara quietly. A neurologist thanked her for her insight. A resident asked if she would consider mentoring. A nurse simply said, "You handled that with more grace than most of us could." She smiled at each of them. But when she was alone again, the strain showed. Only briefly, a tiredness in her shoulders. A pause before she opened her folder. Inside were handwritten notes, coded charts, and a slim sealed envelope. She touched the envelope for a moment, then closed the folder again. Across the hall, Voss watched her through the glass. One of the board directors approached him. "You're making a mistake." He did not look away. "She's hiding something. Perhaps because she has reason to. She speaks like someone trained outside normal systems." The director gave him a measured glance. "That should tell you something." Voss finally turned. "What exactly do you know about her?" The director hesitated. "Only that when the advisory committee reviewed her work, they said there were people at the federal level who would clear schedules to hear her speak." That answer did not reassure him. It only deepened the mystery. As evening approached, the conference prepared for its final private roundtable before dinner. Attendance was limited. Only top-level specialists and board members. Alara received an invitation. Voss noticed. "You're joining us?" She nodded. "That's what I was told." He gave a dry smile. "Then perhaps tonight we'll finally learn who you really are." She looked at him carefully. "No," she said softly. "Tonight, you'll only learn what you need to." That answer stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. The roundtable began at 7. Discussions were serious, focused, strategic. And despite himself, Voss found that whenever she spoke, the room listened more closely. Not because of authority, because of clarity. She had no need to dominate. She simply understood. Halfway through the evening, one of the executives received a call and stepped outside. When he returned, his face had changed. He whispered something to the board chair. The chair stood immediately. "Excuse us." The two of them left the room in silence. Conversations slowed. An uneasy feeling settled in. 10 minutes later, the distant sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Several. Fast. Then voices. Urgent. The conference doors opened sharply. Hospital staff turned toward the entrance. And in stepped a group of federal agents. Dark suits. Earpieces. Official badges. The room froze. No one understood what was happening. The lead agent scanned the room once. Then his eyes landed on Alara. Relief crossed his face. "There you are." Every head turned toward her. Voss stood. "What is the meaning of this?" The agent ignored him. He stepped forward quickly. "Doctor, we need you immediately." The room went silent. The same woman who had spent all day being questioned was now the center of a federal emergency. Voss stared, unable to process it. "What is this about?" The agent finally looked at him. His expression was firm. With respect, Chief Surgeon, this is beyond your clearance. Then he turned back to Alara. It's happening faster than expected. She rose slowly. No surprise in her face. Only resolve. She picked up her leather folder. The same one everyone had dismissed. And for the first time that day, the room understood one thing clearly. They had never really known who she was. The conference room remained frozen long after the federal agents entered. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the projector still glowing against the far wall. Chief Surgeon Roland Voss stood near the head of the table, his hand still resting on the back of his chair. For the first time in years, he looked completely unprepared. The lead agent stepped closer to Alara Quinn and lowered his voice, though everyone in the room could still hear the urgency. We've lost contact with the secure unit in Arlington. Symptoms began 37 minutes ago. They're escalating. Alara's expression sharpened. How many? 6 confirmed. 2 critical. She gave a brief nod. Transport. Ready downstairs. That was when Voss finally found his voice. Excuse me, this is still a hospital. I need an explanation. The agent turned toward him, composed but direct. Dr. Quinn is required for a national-level medical emergency. Voss frowned. She is a consultant at my conference. The room felt the tension rise again. The agent's gaze did not shift. She is not only a consultant. That sentence settled over everyone like a weight. Several board members exchanged looks. A resident near the door quietly stepped back. Alara picked up her leather folder and slipped the sealed envelope into her coat pocket. Then she turned to the room. I apologize for the interruption. It was such a calm response that it almost made the moment more surreal. Voss stared at her. You knew this could happen? Possibly. And you said nothing? She met his eyes. I wasn't here to discuss it. Before he could answer, the board chair stepped forward. Dr. Quinn, if there's anything we should know. There isn't, she said gently. Then, after a pause, she added, only that what's happening requires speed, not speculation. She started toward the door. But before leaving, she turned back once more. There was something different in her posture now. Still composed, but carrying an authority no one had fully seen until this moment. She looked directly at Voss. Your protocols are strong, she said. But not every crisis fits established systems. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't revenge. It was a lesson. Then she walked out with the agents. The room stayed silent for several long seconds after the doors closed. Finally, someone whispered, Who exactly is she? No one answered, because no one truly knew. Downstairs, a black government vehicle waited outside the emergency entrance. As Alara entered, another agent handed her a secured tablet. She scanned the incoming data quickly. Neurological instability, cognitive confusion, rapid onset memory distortion. Her face grew more serious. This isn't environmental. No, the agent replied. We confirmed containment. She looked up sharply. Then it's systemic. The agent nodded. That's what they feared. She leaned back in the seat, eyes focused. How long before total cascade? At current rate? Less than 2 hours. She exhaled slowly. Then we're already behind. The vehicle moved through city traffic under escort. Inside, no one spoke unless necessary. Alara reviewed patient logs, biometrics, and encrypted case notes. Every detail mattered. By the time they arrived at the secure medical facility outside Arlington, she already had a working theory. The building itself looked ordinary from the outside. Low profile, minimal markings, but security was unlike any hospital she had visited. Biometric scans, armed personnel, restricted corridors. As she entered the main unit, senior officials were waiting. One stepped forward immediately. We're relieved you're here. Alara removed her gloves. Brief me. They walked quickly down the hall. Initial symptoms appeared during routine testing. Confusion, memory gaps, delayed recognition. Then motor instability. Shared exposure? That's what we thought. But no common source. She stopped walking. Show me the baseline files. Inside the secure ward, 6 patients were under observation. Highly trained personnel, medical researchers, analysts, specialists, all displaying the same pattern. Alara studied each chart. Then she looked around the room. Who approved today's protocol? A senior physician hesitated. Why? Because someone changed the calibration sequence. Silence. She pointed to the monitor. The cognitive reset intervals were shortened. That was within acceptable range. For standard systems. She turned sharply. These aren't standard systems. The physician's face shifted. He knew she was right. One of the officials stepped closer. Can you stabilize them? She looked at the patients. Then at the data. Yes. A pause. But only if we stop treating this like a traditional medical event. Within minutes, she reorganized the response team. Different environment controls. Modified sensory input. Staggered neural recalibration instead of simultaneous resets. The room moved fast. Under her direction, every action had purpose. No hesitation. No wasted motion. She wasn't just giving orders. She understood the system from the inside out. An hour later, the first patient responded. Memory recognition returned. Speech normalized. Vitals stabilized. Relief spread across the room. By the second hour, all 6 were improving. The crisis had shifted. Containment was no longer the goal. Recovery was. One of the officials approached her quietly. You saved them. She removed her gloves again. No. We corrected the mistake. He lowered his voice. Washington wants a full briefing. Later. He hesitated. They're also asking about St. Alder. That made her pause. What about it? The chief surgeon filed an inquiry during transport. She looked at him. About me? Yes. She said nothing. He continued carefully. Your presence there triggered internal review. She almost smiled. Of course it did. He's asking why a federal response unit would deploy for someone with no visible agency affiliation. Her gaze drifted for a moment. Then she said quietly, because he believes records define people. The official studied her. You could tell him. No. Why not? She turned back toward the patients. Because if someone needs my resume to understand my value, the explanation won't matter. Back at St. Alder, the atmosphere had completely changed. Conference sessions were suspended. Staff whispered in hallways. Phones rang constantly. No one could focus. Chief Surgeon Roland Voss remained in his office, reviewing everything he could access. He had already contacted the advisory committee, the hospital board, and 2 federal liaisons. Every path led nowhere. Most files were restricted. Others were heavily redacted. But one internal note had slipped through. A short classification line. Operational Medical Advisor, Tier 7 access. That was all. Tier 7. He knew enough to understand what that meant. It was not ordinary, and certainly not something assigned lightly. For the first time, a crack appeared in his certainty. He replayed every conversation from the day. Every dismissive remark. Every challenge. And what unsettled him most was not her knowledge. It was her restraint. She could have exposed him at any moment. Instead, she had allowed him to reveal himself. That realization sat heavily with him. Late that evening, the board chair entered his office. She's returning tomorrow. Voss looked up. Returning? Yes. To finish the conference. He stared for a moment. After all this? She requested it. That surprised him more than anything. Why? The board chair gave a faint smile. She said unfinished work deserves completion. After he left, Voss remained seated in silence. He had spent decades believing excellence followed one path. Degrees, titles, institutions, everything measurable, everything visible. But Alara Quinn had walked into his world carrying none of what he valued most, and still surpassed expectations he hadn't even known he had. For the first time in years, he questioned his own judgment, and that uncertainty was harder to face than any professional challenge. The next morning, before dawn, a single black car pulled quietly into St. Alder's underground garage. Alara stepped out, tired but steady. She carried the same leather folder, same calm expression, as if the events of the night had been just another responsibility. At the private entrance, she was met by a nurse from the previous day, the same one who had thanked her. "You came back." Alara smiled softly. "I said I would." The nurse hesitated. "Everyone's talking." "I assumed so. They know now that you're important." Alara adjusted her coat. "Importance is temporary." The nurse looked at her carefully. "Then what lasts?" Alara paused, then answered in a quiet voice. "How you treat people before you know who they are." And with that, she walked toward the conference hall. This time, no one would see her the same way again. By the time Dr. Alara Quinn walked back into St. Alder Medical Center, the building felt different. Not physically. The polished floors were still the same. The glass walls still reflected the morning light. Staff still moved quickly between departments, trying to pretend everything was normal. But something had shifted underneath it all. People no longer looked at her the same way. Whispers followed her down corridors. Conversations stopped when she passed. Even those who had dismissed her the day before now studied her carefully, as if trying to understand what they had missed. Alara noticed none of it in any obvious way, or perhaps she chose not to. She walked with the same calm pace, holding her worn leather folder, moving toward the conference hall as if she were simply continuing a conversation that had been paused. Inside the main auditorium, the final session of the medical summit was already delayed. Chief Surgeon Roland Voss stood near the front, arms crossed, watching the entrance. He had not slept. That much was clear. There was a heaviness in his posture now, something less sharp than before. Not weakness exactly, but something closer to uncertainty. When Alara entered, the room quieted instantly. No introduction was needed anymore. Everyone knew her name, even if they still didn't understand it. Voss straightened slightly as she approached. "You returned," he said. "Yes," she replied simply. "For the conference?" "For closure." A few people in the room exchanged glances at that word. Closure. It sounded final in a way no one expected. She took her seat again at the table, but this time, no one tried to place her at the edge. No one suggested distance. The atmosphere had shifted too much for that. Voss remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. Then he slowly sat down opposite her. For a brief silence, neither of them spoke. Then he finally said, "The federal unit confirmed your involvement in the Arlington incident." Alara nodded. "They did. You stabilized all 6 patients in under 2 hours." "Yes." A pause. "That level of response requires authorization beyond standard medical clearance." She looked at him. "It does." Voss leaned forward slightly. "Then tell me what you actually are." The question was no longer mocking. It was direct. And beneath it there was something else now. Need. Alara did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened her leather folder and placed a thin stack of documents on the table. No one touched them, but everyone leaned in slightly. "These are not public records," she said. Voss studied her face. "What are they?" "Parts of my work history." One of the board members whispered. "Work history," Alara continued. "Most of it is classified. Not because it is secret in the traditional sense, but because it involves systems that operate outside standard medical frameworks." Voss narrowed his eyes. "You're saying you work outside the medical establishment." "I'm saying I work where the medical establishment cannot always go." The room went still. She turned one page of the document toward him. A list of international response deployments, crisis zones, containment regions, humanitarian emergencies. Voss scanned it quickly. His expression tightened. "These are military-adjacent operations." "Some of them," she said. "You're not a surgeon in the traditional sense. I am a surgeon when surgery is needed. And when it's not, I adapt." The simplicity of her answer unsettled him more than any complex explanation could have. Voss leaned back slightly. "So what are you then? A consultant? A field doctor? A government asset?" Alara met his gaze. "I am a medical advisor for systems that don't have the luxury of stability." That sentence hung in the air. No one spoke. Even Voss seemed momentarily stuck on it. Finally, he said, "And the CIA?" A few heads lifted at that. Alara didn't react. "Yes," she said. The confirmation was calm. Not dramatic. Not defensive. Just factual. Murmurs spread across the room. Voss's eyes narrowed. For how long? Long enough. That's not an answer. It is the only one that matters. The room felt like it had tightened around them. Voss studied her carefully now. Were you assigned to St. Alder? No. Then why are you here? She paused. For you. The words landed heavily. Even Voss didn't respond immediately. For me. Alara nodded once. You lead one of the most advanced surgical teams in the country. Your protocols influence national trauma response models. When your system works, thousands benefit. She stopped. But your system also assumes certainty where there is none. Voss's jaw tightened. And you came here to prove that? No. Then why? She looked at him for a long moment. Because systems improve faster when the people inside them are willing to see what they miss. Silence followed. A long one. Then Voss said quietly, "And what have I missed?" Alara's expression softened slightly. People like me. That answer hit harder than anything she had said before. Not because it was insulting, but because it was true in a way he could not immediately dismiss. He leaned forward again. Let's assume I accept your background, your claims, your clearance. That still doesn't explain your behavior. My behavior? You allowed yourself to be humiliated yesterday without defending yourself. Faint pause. That is not typical of someone with authority. Alara looked down for a moment, then back up. Authority doesn't require constant proof. The assess frowned. In my experience, it does. That's the difference between us. The room felt the weight of that exchange. Voss stared at her. You think I operate on ego? I think you operate on certainty. And you don't. I operate on outcomes. The simplicity of her distinction created a silence that no one wanted to break. Voss exhaled slowly. For the first time, he looked less like a man defending a position and more like someone trying to understand one. Why keep all of this hidden? He asked. Alara hesitated, then answered quietly. Because recognition can interfere with the work. That line stayed in the air longer than expected. One of the senior physicians finally spoke. You've been doing this kind of work? Alone? Alara shook her head slightly. Not alone, but often without visibility. Voss studied her carefully again. And what exactly does the CIA need from a surgeon? Alara closed the folder gently. Not surgery in the way you understand it. She paused. They need people who can understand how systems fail when human cognition is disrupted at scale. That sentence confused some in the room. But not all. A neurologist leaned forward slightly. You're talking about cognitive system collapse events. Alara nodded once. Yes. The neurologist looked uneasy. That's not common in civilian medicine. No, she agreed. It's not. Voss finally looked away for a moment, processing. When he looked back, his tone was quieter. And St. Alder? Alara answered without hesitation. It is part of a larger observation point. That made several people in the room tense. Observation, Voss repeated. Yes. For what? For how modern hospitals respond under stress when assumptions fail. The implication was uncomfortable. St. Alder was not just a hospital. It was part of something larger. A testing ground for resilience. A mirror. Voss stood slowly. You mean we were being evaluated? Alara did not deny it. You were being observed. The distinction mattered. But only slightly. Voss walked a few steps away from the table, running a hand through his hair. This entire conference. It still has value, she said. He turned back. Does it? Yes. How? Because what you learned about me is not the important part. Voss gave a short, bitter laugh. You humiliated me in front of my own team. Alara's expression did not change. You did that yourself. The room went completely silent. Even the air seemed still. Voss froze. What did you say? Alara looked at him steadily. You decided I was unqualified before you asked what I could do. That sentence hung between them like a line that could not be crossed back over. For the first time, Voss had no immediate reply. Not anger. Not argument. Just silence. He slowly sat back down. And this time it looked like a different man sitting there. Not defeated, but reconsidering everything. The room remained quiet for a long moment. Finally, Voss spoke again. If what you're saying is true, then why reveal any of it now? Alara picked up her folder again. Because the system is shifting. Shifting how? She paused, then said, faster than most hospitals are prepared for. That final sentence carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. Outside the conference hall, alarms did not sound. No emergency lights flashed. Nothing dramatic happened. But inside that room, something fundamental had changed. The people who had once judged her now realized they had been standing in the presence of something they had not understood. And Chief Surgeon Roland Voss, who had built his entire identity on knowing, sat quietly, realizing that certainty was not the same as truth. And for the first time since she arrived at St. Alder, Alara Quinn was no longer the subject of doubt. She was the one they were all trying to understand. The conference at St. Alder Medical Center did not end the way anyone expected. There was no closing ceremony, no final applause, no polished speeches summarizing achievements. Instead, the room slowly emptied in quiet uncertainty, as if everyone was afraid that speaking too loudly would break something fragile they had just begun to understand. Dr. Alara Quinn remained seated for a few moments after the last discussion ended. Her leather folder rested in front of her, untouched now. The papers inside were no longer important for the people around her. Not because they lacked value, but because the meaning had already shifted. Chief Surgeon Roland Voss stood near the far end of the room, watching her. He had not spoken much after her last explanation. That silence had not been anger anymore. It had been reflection. The kind that settles in when a person realizes their framework for understanding the world might be incomplete. Finally, he walked toward her. Not with the same authority he had carried the day before. Something had softened in his steps. When he stopped in front of her, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. I need to ask you something, he said. Alara looked up. Yes. His voice lowered slightly. Did you come here expecting this reaction? She considered the question. No, she said honestly. Then what did you expect? A conversation, she replied. A faint, almost tired smile appeared on his face. That's not what happened. No, she agreed. It rarely does at first. Voss looked at her carefully. I spent years building systems people trust. Protocols, procedures, standards. And yet you walked in and challenged things I didn't even know could be questioned. Alara did not interrupt. He continued. And I realize now that I didn't challenge you because of your credentials. I challenged you because I didn't understand them. A pause. That is not the same thing. She nodded slightly. It isn't. He exhaled slowly. Do you think I was wrong to doubt you? Alara looked at him for a moment, then answered with quiet honesty. No. The answer surprised him. She continued. Doubt is part of good medicine. Keeps systems careful. Prevents blind trust. Voss studied her face. But the way I expressed it, that, she said gently, was not doubt. That was assumption. Silence followed again. Not uncomfortable this time. Just real. Voss nodded slowly, absorbing that. I misjudged you, he admitted. Alara did not respond immediately. Then she said, yes. The simplicity of it made him pause. No punishment. No satisfaction. No emotional weight. Just truth. After a moment, he asked, what happens now? Alara looked down at her folder. That depends on the system. The system? She nodded. People like me don't stay in one place for long unless needed. Voss frowned slightly. And are you needed here? For the first time, Alara hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was choosing whether to give it. Then she said, "Not in the way you think." He waited. She continued, "St. Alder is stable. Your teams are strong. Your protocols are advanced." A pause. But systems are never just about stability. They're about adaptation. Voss understood what she meant. "You think we're resistant to change." "No," she corrected gently. "I think every system becomes comfortable with its own success." That sentence stayed between them for a long moment. Voss finally nodded. "And you're here to make sure we don't become too comfortable." Alara stood slowly. "I was here to observe. And now," she picked up her folder. "Now I report." The word carried weight. Not threatening, but final in a different way. Voss looked at her carefully. "To who?" She met his gaze. "To people who need to understand how real-world medical systems function under pressure." A pause. "And how they fail." That last line was not an accusation. It was assessment. Voss looked away for a moment, processing. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I don't like the idea of being evaluated." Alara nodded. "Most people don't." "Then why continue it?" "Because evaluation is not punishment." She stepped slightly toward the exit. "It's improvement." Voss didn't stop her. He watched as she reached the door. But before she left, she paused. Without turning fully back, she said, "You asked earlier why I allowed myself to be questioned so openly." Voss looked up. "Yes," she continued, "because how a system reacts when it believes it has power tells you more than when it knows it is being watched." And then she left. The room remained still long after she was gone. In the following days, St. Alder Medical Center tried to return to normal. Meetings resumed. Patients were treated. Schedules were followed. But something had changed beneath the surface. Doctors spoke differently now. Questions were asked more carefully. Assumptions were tested more often. And in quiet moments, staff still mentioned her name. Not with confusion anymore, but with respect. Or curiosity. Or both. Chief Surgeon Roland Voss was seen less in public spaces that week. When he did appear, he was quieter. More reflective. One evening, he stood alone in his office, reviewing recorded footage from the conference. He paused often, rewound sections, listened again, not to her words, but to his own responses. At one point, he stopped the recording completely. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, he admitted something to himself without resistance. He had not failed as a surgeon, but he had failed to see beyond his own framework. The next morning, he submitted a formal internal review request, not of Alara Quinn, but of the hospital's evaluation protocols. Several board members were surprised. One asked him directly, "Is this because of her?" Voss paused, then answered carefully, "It's because of what she showed us." The answer was not emotional, but it was honest. Elsewhere, Alara was already gone from the city. Her work did not require permanence in one place. She moved between systems, between hospitals, between institutions that needed observation more than recognition. But before leaving the region, she made one final stop. A quiet hallway in the administrative wing of St. Alder. She placed a sealed report in an internal drop box marked for the executive board. Inside it were observations, not criticisms, not judgments, but structured assessments of system efficiency, decision latency, and cognitive bias patterns under pressure. At the end of the document, she wrote a single line. "Competence is not the absence of error. It is the ability to correct it quickly." Then she closed it and walked away. Weeks later, St. Alder Medical Center received a formal acknowledgement from a Federal Advisory Medical Coordination Unit. There was no public announcement, no press release, just a brief internal letter confirming that the hospital's participation in a national evaluation program had concluded successfully. Most staff never understood what that meant, but those who had been in the conference room that day did. And among them, Chief Surgeon Roland Voss read the letter twice before placing it down. He didn't feel humiliated anymore. He didn't feel defensive either. What he felt was something quieter. Awareness, not of her authority, but of his own limitations. Later that evening, he walked through the hospital corridors alone. The same corridors where he had once dismissed her presence. He stopped briefly near the conference room. Empty now, quiet, ordinary again. But not really, because nothing felt entirely ordinary after someone had shown you how much you didn't see. Voss placed a hand on the doorframe, then lowered it. And for the first time since the beginning of the conference, he didn't think about winning or losing an argument. He thought about something else entirely. Understanding. And somewhere far away, Dr. Alara Quinn continued her work, moving between places that rarely appeared in reports, ensuring that when systems were tested again, fewer people would mistake confidence for certainty. Because in her world, what mattered most was never how someone entered a room. It was what remained after they left it.